The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, Lang, I blew it again, but
nobody knew.
Nobody should have known it. Yeah, well, yeah, but that's why I said it. So that's just because I like to tell it myself. Anyway, must be a fetish or something. Anyway, good evening, everyone. This is Wayne Parker, as I said, and Lang Baker once again is with us, co-hosting. Good evening, Lang.
Howdy, Wayne.
And I'd like to remind listeners that this is a live call-in show. You may call in, and you are encouraged to call in during the program, 343-9927, 343-9927, to share your thoughts, ideas, perspectives, or criticisms on the topic or anything that Lang and I might say. If you don't mind me speaking for you, Lang, I mean, I don't know how sensitive you might be to somebody disagreeing with you.
No problem.
Yeah,
no
I didn't
problem.
think so. I don't mean either. I'd like to say that if I'm wrong about something, I'd like to be at least the second person to know it. Anyway, our topic for this evening, Lang, as I mentioned in our promo, is inattentional blindness. Can we really be so focused on something that we would fail to see a gorilla standing right in front of us? And I meant gorilla. I won't go into that particular scenario, but I'm looking at an American Psychological Association article called Sights Unseen by Siri Carpenter from back in 2001, actually. And it starts off describing a scenario. It says, picture this, a teenager cruising down a familiar highway, keeping a conscientious eye on the speedometer, the rearview mirror, and oncoming traffic. Too late, he notices a deer standing in the road. He slams on his brakes, but can't avoid striking the animal. And, of course, when he goes home and tells his parents that he hit a deer that had been standing in the middle of the road, they're like, how could you miss a deer? How could you fail to see a deer standing in the middle of the road? But nevertheless, he actually did fail to see it. And there was another study mentioned in this article by, there was a study by the late Irvin Rock, Ph.D. at the University of California, and Arian Mack, Ph.D. of the New School for Social Research, where they sat somebody down in front of a computer monitor and told them to focus on a small cross that would appear briefly on the screen repeatedly. And they told the participants to judge which arm of the cross was longer. And after several of these trials, seeing this little cross with supposedly different lengths of its arms or whatever, an unexpected object such as a brightly colored rectangle appeared on the screen along with the cross. And most of the people in the test failed to see that alien object, even though it remained there for like 9 seconds. And this is what they identify here as inattentional blindness. And the definition of it, I just read that to you, now I can't see it, but it's basically the failure to see an object due to some reason other than a visual deficit, is what it is. I mean, if you have normal eyesight, normal perception, as we perceive that, if you still fail to see an object in an instance like this, that's inattentional blindness.
That's the name for that phenomenon.
For that phenomenon, yes. And I was thinking that just we're so focused on one thing or one object that we don't see anything around it. We're too focused on something. What have you seen?
That's one explanation that's given for it. There are a number of competing theories and different studies trying to figure out how come this happens and why it happens with some people and not with others. Because a lot of the studies, it's not like 100% of the people don't see this unexpected object. There's a certain percentage
some
of people
do, yeah.
And so there have been studies trying to figure out why it is that some people do and some people don't. And like one researcher was saying, well, when we see that 30% don't see it, does that mean 30% of the people never see it, or does that mean that everybody misses it 30% of the time, So,
and like we've talked before too, our perception or our ability to see things is also influenced by our current mood at the time, physical condition or whatever. So who knows?
Yeah. So they've done different studies trying to parse out different possible explanations of what's going on, and in the characteristics of individuals who do perceive it to distinguish them from people who don't. And some of them are looking at, well, there was one study that used college students. I mean, I once heard psychology described as the study of the behavior of college sophomores, but they were looking at non-ADHD and ADHD college students and comparing them, and they found that the ADHD college students had a much lower rate of inattentional blindness, that they were recognizing these unexpected objects at a much higher rate.
Yeah, and we don't really know why. This one article I have here suggests that an attentional deficit could give them the advantage, but it may be just a hyperactive portion of some other part of their attention that enables them, the ADHD sufferers, to perceive these things. And we don't even know. Maybe they're just way ahead of the typical human being.
Or maybe
and because they don't fit our norm,
Yeah, maybe they just have brain activity going on that is more attuned to noticing unexpected objects.
Right. Or like the way I'm thinking anyway is that they have. I'm thinking back to Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, where he described 10 case studies of some people who had an extreme neurological deficit in their brain, and some who had an extreme neurological exaggeration, so to speak, in a part of their brain. And that's what I'm wondering, if maybe the ADHD sufferers have one part of the brain that's super, accelerated or whatever, or sensitive.
Well, I don't think I'd use the word sufferers.
I know. I knew you'd challenge me on that.
But people who exhibit ADHD traits on whatever test they use to determine whether a person's ADHD or not.
I'm trying to be, I'm going for brevity here. I talk fast anyway, so I try to limit the number of words. So suffering is easier, but okay, Lang, I'll indulge you. But you see my point, though.
There's some brain
possessors.
Activity there, some brain activity that is more supportive of recognizing unexpected objects at a conscious level. I mean, there are studies showing that certain things that we don't recognize in our visual field at a conscious level still have an impact on our behavior, so they were perceived at some level. I mean, this gets back into the question of, well, what's perception? Where on the threshold from unconscious to conscious does a relation to what's entered the sense organ described as having been perceived?
Yeah, but I guess what I'm thinking is, if you can't give voice to your perception of something or having seen something, you can't tell anybody that you did. You probably don't know that you did.
Yeah, perhaps. Or I don't know if there have been any studies trying to inquire under hypnosis whether they could report having seen it or not.
Does hypnosis work? You
Well,
just threw me a curveball there. I'm not even sure how it supposedly works or anything. I don't.
Well, I don't know. We can have another program on hypnosis. I can't.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
reliably report on the full spectrum of what's involved in that. But I know that sometimes hypnosis is used in an effort to discover what eyewitnesses saw or didn't see. And then there's been challenges to the reliability of whether the person who hypnotized them planted memories there that weren't true. And then you've got somebody reporting an honest report that they have a memory of this when, in fact, it never happened.
It never happened, right. Getting back briefly to the hypnosis thing, though, whether or not it works, I have seen one live performance with a hypnotist, and I noticed, all the people that appeared to be hypnotized seemed genuine, but there were a few, while he was administering the hypnotism, I guess, where he would just go tap them on the shoulder and tell them to go sit back down in the audience. And I guess he could sense that they weren't going into it. They weren't having. He wasn't having the effect on them that apparently the other ones did. And that could be part of the act too. I don't know. I'm an eternal skeptic, except when I'm naive about something. But so there could be something to that. But sure.
So it'd be interesting to see whether there have been any studies on inattentional blindness where they attempted to hypnotize the people who didn't report seeing it and see if they reported from a hypnotized state that they did in fact see the gorilla.
Okay, and on that question, do you happen to recall seeing any studies where they monitored parts of the brain for increased activity, parts of the brain that don't deal with the conscious seeing of something? You know what I'm saying? Like I've seen things done before where they can register a certain activity or certain emotional reaction in a brain to something that is subconscious. I
didn't see anything on that related to the inattentional blindness, but there was one study that showed that they used the control group that was given just a narration about raisins, and the other group was led through mindfulness meditation on eating a raisin. So they were exercising the parts of the brain that are involved in entering a state of mindfulness. And then they did the gorilla test. And the people who had gone through the mindfulness exercise had a lower incidence of inattentional blindness. They saw the gorilla more often than the people who didn't. Okay,
now we haven't talked about the gorilla test yet. Which gorilla test are you talking about? The one with the tiny gorilla in the stationary picture? Okay. Yeah. What Lang is talking about, and is what got me interested in this topic after Lang called my attention to it, is there's a video online. It's the Cosmic Gorilla. I think if you Google that, it'll bring up that video.
You'll probably get to it that way. I think that will lead you to this article.
Well, yeah, the article is there, but you could find the videos the video precedes the article. Anyway, for the listeners, you're told to watch the following video and count how many times the people in the white shirts pass a basketball back and forth. And I should have explained ahead of time. It's a video of two small groups of people.
Three each,
okay. Half dressed in white shirts, half dressed in black, and they're bouncing basketballs back and forth to each other or passing them to each other. And the instructions are to count how many times the people in the white T-shirts pass the ball to someone. And I watched it, and Lang, I got it exactly correct, 15. Mm-hmm. 15. And then it said the answer is 15. And I'm like, hey, look at me, I'm smart. And then it said, did you see the gorilla? And I was like, no. And they played the video, in fast motion, and I saw a gorilla walk through the scene. And I didn't believe it, so I went back and watched the video again and just watched it casually without trying to focus on anything. And sure enough, this person in a gorilla outfit walks into the center of the screen right in front of me, turns and faces the camera, beats its chest, and then strolls on off the picture. And I never, ever saw that. But I counted how many times the white shirt people, passed the ball.
You completed the assigned task.
Yes.
Accurately.
Right. And that's where I get praise for, right?
Yeah.
When you do it as a kid, you won.
Yeah, so this is the famous inattentional blindness gorilla test.
Mm-hmm. And that's what you were saying.
There's a percentage of people that, like you, didn't notice the gorilla. And so they did this experiment where they led half the people through this mindfulness instruction for eating a raisin mindfully, and they saw the gorilla a lot more often than the people who didn't. In another study, they told the subjects to count how many times the people with the black T-shirts on passed it back and forth, and they saw the gorilla more often. There still were a percentage who didn't see the gorilla, but the explanation is that, the gorilla was dressed in a black costume, and so it was more like what the subjects were focused on in counting the passes of the basketball, and so then it wasn't as alien to what they were focused on.
And that was a key point that I don't think I emphasized, Lang. It's the failure to see something that's totally unexpected is primarily the thing with inattentional blindness.
Yeah, something unexpected.
Yeah, and I'd like to remind the listeners real quickly. Then I have another. I want to mention something that you or related to what you said, but you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're discussing inattentional blindness and other mind tricks, like we've discussed many times in the past, regarding the brain. But you can call in 343-9927, 343-9927 if you can share anything, want to share anything, or if you want to call in and tell us we're full of baloney, as long as you can back it up. Please do, 343-9927. Lang, you mentioned the mindfulness exercises and how that reduced the inattentional blindness of the people who were given those exercises ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
You also mentioned when we were discussing this before the show that the Japanese culture, or Japanese people, when they compared the cultures between American and Japanese, the Japanese seemed to less susceptible to the inattentional blindness.
Well, no, that study didn't relate specifically to inattentional blindness. It was a study on attention, because I got off on the track of attention when looking at inattentional blindness is that the individual is blind to an unexpected event when their attention is focused on something else. So I got to go, well, what exactly is attention? And so then I came across this study about how attention is not the same in all cultures. And one example were these studies comparing attention to the context and to the object being focused upon. And they found that when they used a number of different tests comparing these Japanese subjects with North American subjects, that the Japanese subjects were much more aware of any changes in the context portion of the image they were looking at, instead of just the center figure that they were focusing on.
Okay.
And then did some eye tracking studies of them while they were looking at these images, and their eyes were focusing on a lot over the whole range of the image that they were looking at, and not just focused primarily on the central figure.
Right, and you used the term holistic, I think, for their particular perception.
That was used as a general description of some perceived cultural differences.
Right, and holistic being you take in
with these measurements.
Holistic being you take in the whole organism or the whole picture instead of just focusing on individual things.
Tend to look more across, yeah. In one of the studies in the difference of attention focus in these cultures, where they gave a series of drawings with one central figure and four figures in the periphery of the picture, faces, and we're asking the subjects to look at the primary figure in the center and describe what emotion was reflected in the facial expression of this individual. And when they did the eye tracking, they saw that the Japanese subjects were taking into account what the faces, their eyes were tracking towards the peripheral images, the peripheral faces as well, and in reaching their conclusions about the emotion of the central figure, whereas the Americans focused just on the central figure.
Yeah, and something I just thought of that's maybe kind of along those lines. I had to teach a class years ago on communication, and I forget what the actual percentages were, but it was something like 60% of human-to-human communication when you're face-to-face is nonverbal. It's not what you say that really works. It's how you say it, your facial expressions, your body language, all these things that we don't really consciously perceive when we're talking with somebody, but we perceive them nonetheless, or they have an influence.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same thing, I guess, with the holistic viewing, or the way the Japanese culture tends to look at things, the context. By the same token, if you're just reading, the written word, you can be way off on communications, as I've experienced.
Yeah, and if you get a text message, it's even
worse. Yeah, when it's
narrowed
condensed,
down as to nuance. But in talking what you just mentioned, reminded me of a study that was reported in a book I've just been reading called "Before You Know It," in this study was saying that, well, let's back up before the study. It was saying that our visual input gets processed through the brain along two different channels altogether. One is what goes to our conscious awareness of what we're looking at, and the other goes more to our, at an unconscious level, our behavioral response to what we're seeing. And the example I gave was like the tendency of people to mirror the gestures and facial expressions of the person they're in conversation with, without us ever or necessarily bringing that to a conscious level. But that's an indication of, instead of inattentional blindness, it's more like inattentional seeing, and at a or below conscious level, where we're picking up on the cues of the other person and responding to it, and not only in just what we're seeing, but also the tendency to use verbal expressions that the other person's using to match our language to their language. And one speculation after reporting this phenomenon was that could explain why it's often said that after a couple have lived together for decades, they start to look like each other, because they're mimicking the facial expressions they see on their partner, and so it strengthens the musculature of the face in the same way that the partner has, and so the two merge towards a similar set of facial expressions.
Okay. So would that be conscious perception or subconscious perception?
Well, it was reported as a non-conscious level. However, I must admit that there have been times when I've realized, that's what I'm doing. It would dawn on me, that feels like the facial expression of so-and-so that I've been spending some time with or whatever.
Okay, and talking about facial expressions reminded me of how, and I think everybody has done this, if not everybody. I know I have, and I suspect you have too, Lang. Have you ever stood face-to-face talking with somebody, and they're talking away, and you're not really listening to them, barely paying attention, but you know when to interject with oh no, and things like that. And as far as they think you're just listening intently to them, and you're not. But somehow your brain can perceive that.
Yeah, your brain's tracking on a certain level, I believe, the narration that's going on without actually absorbing the content of it.
Yeah, you're basically,
or at least not consciously absorbing the content of it. Now, maybe later on in hypnosis, you'll be able to report verbatim what you heard.
If hypnosis is real, yeah. Getting back to the idea of holistic viewing, or looking at the whole picture, and the idea that might be an influence or a mitigating factor with inattentional blindness. There are some people talking about intuitive people as opposed to analytical people having different rates of perception of an object in a picture that doesn't belong there. In this case, it was a tiny gorilla in a picture of the surface of Mars, I think, or whatever, or a mountain range. And it was the intuitive people, they said, that tended to see that more. And I have an article here that discusses that. It's from Biz Journal, bizjournals.com, when to rely on intuition instead of analysis in your decision making. And the gist of the article is that you should use both intuition, your gut feeling, and data analysis, and try to come to an intelligent and correct decision that way. Your chances are better that way if you use both.
Mm-hmm.
And I see your wheels are turning there. Is there something? Okay. But that also made me think of, too, I mean, that's kind of what you're saying with the Japanese, and they're culturally, they tend to focus on context, so they're less susceptible to inattentional blindness. And it reminded me of something that Ayn Rand once espoused, stating that for human beings, the ego is the highest quality, or intellectual quality, or highest sense of our minds, and therefore human beings should rely just on that. And that leaves out a whole lot of other perceptions that influence our ability to perceive the world. And to me, when I finally broke out of that spell and all back then, I realized that's kind of like saying that because a dog's sense of smell is its most highly developed sense, that it should only rely on its sense of smell and not its sight or hearing or anything else. That's just dumb. But it still goes to the same point. I think that the more inputs you have, the more consciously alert you are. I mean,
well, I think it would depend on which input was most significant for the moment. That you actually, if you've got too much, one of the benefits allegedly for inattentional blindness, it allows us to focus on what's important.
Right.
And if you've got too many inputs and you're scattered across all of that, and you find you're seeing everything except you're not attending to the threat that's about to eat your lunch or whatever, So evolutionarily, they've speculated that this inattentional blindness served that benefit. In fact, some of the studies on this inattentional blindness is that when people notice more if it's an animal or a human entering the scene unexpectedly than if it's some object. That when we're scanning, well, that's another feature of this attention. Is some of the theories are like we're out there at one level, our below conscious level, our sight processing is scanning what's coming in to see what needs attention,
relevant.
What needs attention. Yeah.
But
and so it notices more, and this would make evolutionary sense when it's an animal or a human that's entering our visual field that may pose a threat or may be an ally or whatever. But it's something that needs attention more than the clouds floating by.
So we'd be more likely to fail to see a boulder hurtling down the side of a mountain, getting ready to crush us.
I don't know if they used boulders in their experiment where they came to the conclusion that they noticed humans and animals more likely.
Okay.
But maybe they were just manipulated images where they changed from one image to the next. They changed something about what was in the image, and if it happened to be an animal or a human that was changed in the image, they were noticed.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking that if that's more of an evolutionary thing, it would be also it would be affected by, I guess, over time with the number of things that pose a threat. And I don't know. Yeah. So that's what I'm thinking. But I think we've all reacted reflexively to something that came up out of the periphery while we were focused on something else.
Yeah.
And I don't think that would be an inattentional blindness, I guess. Well, no, it's not, because you perceive it. But
yeah. There's some discussion about the overt and covert visual processing that goes on. And the overt is what we're consciously directing our attention on, or our visual field on, and covert is like something coming up in your periphery that's below the conscious level. There's a message, say, alert, alert, and then you shift your attention to that.
Yeah, that was kind of like me, and I know I bring this up a lot, but the night that I zombied out on my motorcycle and ran through a stop sign, ran through an intersection and had my wreck, but I recall that what snapped me out of my trance was the perception of a stop sign in my peripheral vision, and something at that instant shook me out of it, because I realized that a stop sign in your peripheral vision when you're moving at 60 miles an hour is not a good thing. There's something wrong here, and it snapped me out. But that was certainly a subconscious thing that that occurred there.
It kicked in.
It snapped me out of it. But let's see here.
So there was another cultural distinction I came across here, cultural difference in perception and attention. And there's a concept of simultaneous attention, which is attending to multiple events at the same time. And this is demonstrated, according to these studies, in children in indigenous communities that interact both with their surroundings and other individuals. And they distinguish this from multitasking, which is alternating attention between multiple activities, whereas Simultaneous attention involves uninterrupted attention to several activities occurring at the same time. And they said they attribute